On a moonlit leaf in the quiet green sits a tiny king no one has seen. Emerald skin in the midnight hush, eyes wide open to the forest rush. He taps his toes in a syncopated sway, calling to the night in a jazz ballet. Every drop of rain is a drum he knows, a rhythm blooming everywhere he goes. Oh, little tree frog, jump in the groove, bounce to the beat till the tall palms move. Little tree frog, sing your song, Carnatic notes where the rivers run along. Tana, tana, hey. Tree frog sway, taka jonu pada, lead the way. Branches hum their ancient tune, Balafon shining under saffron moon. Frog lifts his voice in the ragas of a rain, a tiny maestro born to explain that the sky and soil are lovers in flight, meeting thunder, kissing through night. He croons his secrets in a ragged law, the law of the forest from a little tree frog. Oh, little tree frog, jump in the groove, bounce to the beat till the tall palms move. A little tree frog, sing your song, Carnatic notes where the rivers run along. Tana, tana, hey. Tree frog sway, taka dee ni taka, light the way. Oh, da dee 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 dee. Leaf drums tapping in a staggered rhythm,